get a little winded, but.
Good evening. It's 5:01 and we'll begin the meeting of the Gates Mills Council. This is a special council meeting that we want to focus on zoning issues. And we have a follow council meeting a week from yesterday as normally scheduled. We're meeting today for a few reasons. Number one, we promised in March when we went through the various recommendations in the comprehensive plan that we would split those between items that were strategic and items that were operational. And the operational ones would be handled by the mayor and his staff in the normal course of doing our thing for the year. And the more strategic ones would be handled by discussions of council over the following year. This was one of those items. It was specifically listed as in the last group of four with a very bold caption that says, "Do not change zoning." So I'm not sure I picked the right word at that time, but that certainly was the spirit of council and of others at the time. Since then, several people have suggested we have workshops, we have special things like this to actually focus on it as opposed to being in a council meeting where we're covering all kinds of other business. And so we really would like to focus our topics in our hour or so today on this. Secondly, we're meeting because we find ourselves always trying to explain to people why we have a certain ordinance or why things are organized this way, or what does P and Z actually do. And so it's good for all those on council, whether you've been on council as long as Ed Welsh, which is a number of renewals, or relatively newer folks on council. So it's good to get this council on the same page, and me as well. My role as treasurer had me always attending these meetings, but now in a different role, need to be more aware of some of the individual regulations. So we've got those two items in front of us. I would like this to get to a pretty much of a directed discussion on a few items, rather than just, for example, saying, should we look at bridle trails or should we have bike paths? Okay, those are some of the items that were in the comprehensive plan. Should we change or not change zoning or setbacks? We need to be much more specific. And then we want to really ask council, do you want research done on these items, or what we currently have, is that okay? Because we can't just say we want to research and evaluate everything. That's what the comprehensive plan started to do 3 years ago. And they did good work and it was all documented. But at the end of the day, because there were several items in there that council did not want to endorse as a collective package, they did not approve the comprehensive plan. Instead, we took it forward with to-dos. And we have those to-dos, and I'd like those to-dos worked off over the next several meetings and months. We've listed some of those down below here in terms of section 3, in terms of future considerations. That's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to be an indication of the kinds of items that were open that we'd like to have more information if we need it, and directed discussion, and then eventually a vote or a sense of council members on whether they want to keep things the way they are with regard to certain ordinances or elements, or add to or subtract from that. I thought it would be helpful in the beginning of this session to remind people where we've come from. So I've used the words circa 96 and 98. For close to 25 years, we have been led in the village here by the growth management plan that was put together by the village and council with an E, and experts back in the 90s. At that time, Highland Heights, Mayfield Village, Pepper Pike were experiencing tremendous amount of growth. 271, if you can remember, was still a divided road with trees in the middle of it. And over the last 25 years, that is obviously all developed. And the village was feeling those same pressures. There were individuals and companies and groups that want to come in here and buy large tracts of land and put up essentially subdivisions more akin to some of our neighbors than what we see here in Gates Mills. And so, not to restrict or stop the growth, but to manage the growth, the village took forth a couple-year effort to identify what should our growth look like? How should we manage it? What are our goals of this process? What do we really care about? What are the policies we're going to follow? And then what strategies are we going to put in place? That took about 2 years, maybe longer. Some of the things like the Section 1160 didn't come up for several years after that, but its genesis would have been back in those days. At that time, the village finalized a plan, which is called the Growth Management Plan. We have it. If anybody ever wants to see it, it's here. We'll get you copies electronically or what have you. It's interesting how much of what we asked for 25 years ago has been working quite well, and still we are following it today. Planning and zoning has dealt with exceptions. Architectural and historical review committees have worked with style and exceptions. Items that required site plan differences have been dealt with. New ordinances have been added where they made sense, such as riparian rights and tree ordinances. So things have changed a little bit. But importantly, the growth management plan that the village has been working under for the last 25 years is still operating today and operating pretty darn effectively. There are 3 primary goals. One was to manage growth. And you can see, including those in the audience, if you happen to have the agenda, I've actually asked Janet to copy, and she has, the sections from the master plan, from the growth management plan, the actual language that council looked at and worked on. And the goal here again was to manage the location and the aspects of growth in order to preserve the character of the village as a rural community of low-density, single-family homes in a bucolic environment compatible with the equine uses in the village. That was one of the first 3 goals. And the policies that the council at that time set forth are listed down there, number 6.
It's under that Sandra has been admitted, is in the waiting room and needs to be admitted
Okay,
on the screen.
can someone open the door for Sandra?
I didn't know.
No, I just looked up there and I saw. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. I didn't look backwards. Mike? Okay, thank you. So with that goal, they put forth 6 individual policies. We won't read all of these on all the pages, but you get a gist. Compatible with the equine uses in the village. That was one of the first 3 goals. And the policies that Okay, let's try again. So with the first goal of managed growth, one of the first policy was to preserve existing fields, open spaces and woodlands through land use regulations and the selective acquisition of properties or conservation easements. And the techniques that the village agreed to do, set out to do to accomplish that policy are those little boxes to the right. If you turn the page 90 degrees, there are 3 things that are going to be the techniques to enable that policy to be put in place. 1, write hillside protection ordinances. 2, write tree and woodland preservation regulations. And 3, acquire, where possible, selective properties. So this is what we've been working under and why we have what we have. The second major goal was to preserve our natural resource and environmental features. And isn't it interesting that 25 years later, when we've issued the comprehensive plan, the number 2 item on that plan of all the hundreds of people that responded, number 1 was safety. Number 2 was our natural environment. Preserve it, enhance it, grow it, protect it. And it's really amazing that, 25 years ago, this essentially was the same major goal. Preserve the environmental integrity of the area, particular emphasis on floodplains, steep slopes, mature wooded areas, water quality that's affected by storm runoff. Again, policies are listed down the side there. Hillside protection standards go into the zoning code to discourage development of hillsides as part of the watershed preservation effort. This also lined up with the Chagrin River watershed master plan that they had. And again, the techniques, if you flip the page, 3 techniques, write hillside protection regulations, tree and woodland preservation regulations, and acquire sensitive properties. And each of those policies has different techniques for it. And then finally, the third, in recognition that we are a small rural community, was to make sure and minimize the impact of new development on the level of services for existing village residents. We don't have thousands and thousands of people living along Fairmount Boulevard or Som Center Road or Warrensville Center Road, where municipal services can come with one swath and collect all the trash with automated machines and trucks. We have homes that have long driveways, curved driveways where we have to make sure we can get a fire truck up and down, let alone a garbage truck. So the recognition was, as a rural community, there are limitations on what we can do. And we can't just agree to do everything everywhere because it just didn't line up with the safety and the services that we had. So I thought that would be helpful to look at those. They're listed back on the agenda on the front page. The goals are the three that are listed. And the strategies go under that A, B, C, D, all the way to F. Todd and I, in preparing, thought it would be good to have this little bit of a stage setting. And then he's going to go through now and go through the current zoning regulations and rules that we have. This may again be a primer for those that are in the field that know all this or have dealt with it through planning and zoning committees or other things. But it's a good overview. So we're going to turn this over to Todd for the next, let's just say 25 or 30 minutes to go through that. He has some materials as well. Janet was good enough to Xerox those, and we've got them though on the screen as well. If you could draw your attention to that. And then after that, we'll talk about specific areas and specific items of the comprehensive plan or the ordinances that you want to discuss, and then decide how we go forward with those. Is that okay with everybody to proceed in that manner?
Sure.
Okay, Todd?
Great. Thank you. Okay. The lecture on zoning for probably 35 to 40 minutes. 12. And so I spent about the last 38 of my 40 plus years of practice really focusing a major part of my practice on zoning. And I have been law director in 4 or 5 different communities over that period of time. And some really innovative stuff that we did in the city of Hudson several years back with respect to growth management. And putting together a very comprehensive land use and development code that really touches on about everything you could think of with respect to development. But I've been working for the Village of Gates Mills since 1989 on various things. I, of course, wasn't law director, but my partner was for many years. And some of the more recent things in the code are things that I actually drafted or helped to draft. I usually was the last one to look through things for my firm on zoning amendments to see if everything was legal and defensible. And I like to start any lecture, even though I'm going through the current zoning in Gates Mills, I like to start with this, and that is everybody needs to know that private owners have property rights protected by the Constitution, not only U.S. Constitution, but the Ohio Constitution. And I've had several constitutional challenges to zoning over the years. I've argued in the Supreme Court 3 or 4 times on zoning cases and taken them up through the courts of Ohio. And I just want to let you know that we really have to be careful when we talk about zoning and weigh the interests of private property owners and interests of the government in regulation. And so I've set out a couple of more recent cases from the U.S. Supreme Court. The first case I have there is Nick versus Township of Scott. you used to have to take zoning constitutional cases through the state courts first before you could go to federal court. That said, you can go directly to federal court if the regulation, the local regulation violates your property rights. And Mrs. Nick had probably 50, 60 acres, maybe more, outside of Pittsburgh. And the township said that if you had a cemetery on your property, you had to keep it open from sunrise to sunset and let members of the public go on your property to see these cemeteries. So she did challenge that, and she prevailed. That was a taking of her property right to keep people off of her property. So it's not really a zoning case, but it is a local regulation case. The next one, though, Muir versus Wisconsin and St. Croix County out of the state of Wisconsin, is a zoning case. In that particular case, there was a zoning regulation which I like to draft, and I've drafted in several codes. We don't have it. And that is what's known as a merger clause, where if you own contiguous lots and they're not, each lot is not the correct area for development, you're deemed to have merged those two and into one lot for zoning purposes. And a lot of communities in Ohio have it, and so did St. Croix County in Wisconsin. And the property owner was on a river and wanted to build two separate houses on two lots that were contiguous. Neither one of the lots met the minimum area size. And the zoning officials said, no, you've got to act as if these are merged. You can build one cottage, one house on those two lots. And the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the local zoning authority, which is kind of interesting because people think that you can't do those types of things as merger clauses. But they said there was value to those properties as deemed as one. And even though they were worth more separated, that still was not a taking under the Fifth Amendment. The other one I like to cite is this O.C. Lorraine Fulton LP, which is Ohio City. It's in Cleveland. It was on a corner lot in Ohio City on Lorraine Avenue. And McDonald's wanted to go in there, and it was a conditional use under that code. Whoops, go back. Under that code in Cleveland. And the Board of Zoning Appeals said, no, you're not going to put that on there. It's too small. A lot for everything that you need for McDonald's, of course, drive-throughs, everything else. And so it was challenged, and actually the city of Cleveland won that case also. And during the case, what happened was the owner then sold it to Metro Health, and there's a Metro Health clinic on that site currently. And then all of these cases date back to 1978 in the Penn Central case, which involved the air rights over Grand Central Station in New York City. And here's the test for whether there is a taking. And so there's a lot of weighing of interests and what were the distinct investment-backed expectations of the owner when the owner bought the property, and particularly what the zoning was at the time it was bought, and the actual character of the government action, whether it's an actual physical taking or it's a regulatory taking. And of course, in that situation, it was a regulatory taking because they were not permitting the Grand Central Station to have an office building built above it for lots of reasons, historic mostly. So those are the sort of that's the background with respect to property rights. And I still remember when I became law director here, Karen pulled me aside and said, you know, owners have property rights. Your partner, Chuck Reel, always told me that. So you have to keep that in mind. I listed now all the zoning use classifications in Gates Mills. You're probably familiar with that, but as you see on the zone map, Most of the communities U1, there's an historic area that's overlaid on that. And then there is the U2 uses. There's various types of U1 properties. If you look on the legend, and I wasn't able to blow that up really well, but you can go online and pull the zone map off the internet and look at it a little bit closer. But there are areas, of course, that are zone residential that are in green and red, I believe, on that map. And anyway, those are smaller lots than the 5 acre, whereas most of the entire community is zone residential, single family with 5 acre lots. Of course, here's all the commercial uses that are listed. And then U3 commercial, which is special permit. If you'll see, go down country clubs, that's the Hunt Club is in that district. And some of these other types of uses, it's a small district, as you can see on the map. I don't like to put prohibited uses in my zoning code, but this has been in there for a long time because it gives the impression that if there's something that's not on here, it's permitted. Well, that's not the case because we have another provision. No map, legend. Conformity required. No structure or premise shall be erected or used in the village except in conformity with the regulations herein. So when it lists in a zoning district, the uses that are permitted, those are what are permitted. If you want to do something else, you're going to have to request a variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. The other thing is, if you don't agree with Dave Biggert's or the building officials' interpretation of a provision of the code, you as a property owner can appeal that to the Board of Zoning Appeals to get a ruling on what should be the interpretation of the code. We have very few of those. I can think maybe one in the last 10 years that I can think of. But most of the Board of Zoning Appeals work is variances. And I do want to say that we don't have a lot of variance requests. And so what that says to me is that our code is in pretty good shape. Where we get zoning variance requests is we have quite a few parcels or lots in Gates Mills that are configured strangely. We have flag lots and other types of things like that. And so it's sometimes difficult also with our hillside protection ordinance, our riparian setback ordinance. It's hard sometimes to find a place on a lot to put a home. And so variances are often needed because you can't tell a property owner who has a residential lot or any property, no, you can't use it. You can't develop it. Now we get applications for huge homes. You don't necessarily have to have a huge home. And maybe a smaller home would fit more appropriately on the lot. But we do get these, and they're mostly based on setback variances, whether it's from side lots, from front setbacks, and also from riparian corridors and protected hillsides. We have several of those. But I would say we meet 12 times a year, sometimes not if we don't have anything. And I don't know, Craig, how many variance requests do we get? Maybe 7 a year. But anyway, our code does permit 2 types of variances. One is a use variance, which is pretty self-explanatory. The other one is what's known as an area variance or an area or size variance, which relates to the area of a lot, the setbacks of a lot. Height is another thing that's an area or size issue. And those in our code, we have 7 factors, and these are factors, meaning that not anyone controls. Every piece of property is different. And I want to talk a little bit about precedent setting, but every property really is different. Every circumstance is different. And so you need to consider these 7 things and weigh them. And our Board of Zoning Appeals is excellent at doing that. Thank God we have Scott on the board who takes us through those 7 factors that are in our code. Those were set forth by the Ohio Supreme Court, specifically in the Duncan versus Middlefield case in 1986. We adopted these in 1991. I actually put them in the code in 1991. They're known as the Duncan factors. Even the courts throughout Ohio call these the Duncan factors from Duncan versus Middlefield. I'm not going to read through them, but these are the things that we go through. Some of these things may not apply in a certain situation. So you kind of skip over those, but other ones you may put a little more weight on. The one that may seem easy is whether the variance is substantial, number 2. What does substantial mean? It depends on the situation and that particular lot and what we're reviewing. And it's not done on a percentage basis either. So if you have a setback requirement of 25 feet and someone wants a 12-foot variance, gee, that's almost 50%. That sounds substantial, but it may not be in that situation depending on the neighborhood and what's next door to it. And the need to provide an opportunity for an owner to develop their lot. Not necessarily as they want to develop it, but to develop it. Now, these are 7 standards that I've pulled out of the common law of Ohio over the years, and I've put in some codes. We don't have these in our code, but these are the things that constitute what's known as an unnecessary hardship, which is the standard that needs to be applied for use type variances. And again, they're pretty self-explanatory, but the most important is number 7. There's no other economically viable use which is permitted in that zoning district for that piece of property. And you cannot take away somebody's use of their, any use of their property or some use of their property through your zoning. So it's always a challenge sometimes to say, well, you could develop it for this, you could develop it for that, you could use it for this, you could use it for that, but not what you want to use it for. For example, rezoning a residential lot to a commercial property. I'm going to skip over amendments and come back, but this is a little bit troublesome. It's in our code now, and we may want to look at doing something with it, but it does apply to use variances. And it does, of course, set out the need for giving notice to abutting and adjoining property owners, which we do for every variance requested, whether it's a use variance or not. And when a use variance is determined by the Board of Zoning Appeals or the Planning and Zoning Commission, they are the same body, same makeup. It then has to go to council for permission and a resolution passed. And I've just highlighted the 2 that are most important in what needs to be looked at and found to justify a use variance. Permit in a use district, any use deemed by the commission to be in general keeping with the uses authorized in such district, and permit the location of a U2, U3 use, which are commercial uses, in another district, which could be a residential district. And you may find on the edges of those, on the zone map, on the edges, there may be properties that abut commercial that may ought to be commercial. We just confronted this recently with a non-conforming use extension. Oh, we gotta go back. Okay, amendments. I think this is something that we've hashed out in council a month or 2 ago and talked about. Our code at 115103 says council may upon its own motion or upon petition. Now, it doesn't say what a petition is, but an application by a property owner is what it actually means. And there has to be a public notice, public hearing before any amendment to the regulations or the zone map districts. So rezoning a piece of property, there has to be public notice and a hearing. The proposed amendment has to be referred by council to the Planning and Zoning Commission for report and recommendation. We're going through that right now with the cannabis ordinance. And if, for example, the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended the approval of cannabis businesses in Gates Mills, and it comes back to council, council would need 6 votes, 3/4 vote of council to overturn the Planning Commission's recommendation. That's also in state law. And there are some cases out there that said state law requires this. And we don't have home rule authority over it because zoning is a police power, which the state can preempt local zoning if it wishes to, and it has in some circumstances. And then there's a whole protest provision in 115103 that owners can protest that request for an amendment, whether it's a text amendment, whether it's a rezoning of property. Text amendment would be our cannabis business prohibition ordinance that you read on first reading and sent to the Planning Commission. It'll be coming back. They looked at it last week and did a review and a recommendation back to council. And it's important that we also comply with the Ohio Revised Code because we're silent as to the number of days of notice for a public hearing in front of council on a zoning amendment. And that has to be done before, there has to be a public hearing before any action is taken on either a text amendment or a rezoning of land.
Todd,
Yeah.
did you start your comment that there may be 1 or 2 things in here that we want to take a look at? Or was that a previous page?
I think that was a previous page. Now, I know, I think Scott came forward with some proposals a couple of months ago in a council meeting with respect to beefing this up a little bit, the amendment process. I think that's fine. And making sure that adequate notice is given to everyone. You know, the public notice in the revised code is putting it in a newspaper of general circulation. But you may wish to do a lot more in Gates Mills, which you certainly can do. And I'm getting to the Conservation Development District, which we had a lot of discussion about. I actually helped to draft this in 2007, along with Chris Courtney, my partner Chuck Reel. Going through it today, and as Scott, I think, went through it in detail a couple of months ago in a council meeting, I still think it's pretty darn good ordinance. But maybe I'm too invested in it. But here are all the subsections, 19 of them, related to these conservation development districts. And it's very, very detailed, very substantive. As I said at that time in a council meeting, we've only had 1 application. And it got through the preliminary stage, as I recall, preliminary plan stage. It never got to final stage. And they backed off and then sold it and developed it for a traditional subdivision. I'm trying to remember the property, and it's located, Scott, help me out here. No, it's.
Was it in the Lockers?
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, River and Mayfield.
Single family.
Yeah, it's off of Mayfield.
Yeah.
And I thought we were doing well getting through preliminary on that. And for some reason, then someone came in and said, "Oh, I want to buy it and do a traditional subdivision." So that was several years ago. That's the only one we've ever really been confronted with officially with an application. So here are all the purposes in subsection 1. I don't think I need to read those. I like to call this a cluster ordinance, cluster home ordinance, because that's what it is. You are clustering homes, whether they're detached or whether they're attached, generally in the middle of the property with lots of green space around and less roadways and utilities and so forth. And developers actually like it, and it's oftentimes used for empty nester housing and 55 and over restricted housing, which of course you can still do under federal law. So I went through the chapter and sort of pulled out what I felt were the important substantive provisions. I think I got really all of the substantive provisions. The council cannot initiate this. The planning commission can't initiate it. It has to be initiated by an owner petition, an owner application. It requires a development plan that's approved by both P&Z and council. It deals with on-site wastewater disposal, has to be approved by the county and Ohio EPA. It has to be a minimum of 25 contiguous acres. You can have either single-family detached or attached homes, but you can't have more than 3 homes attached under this. And no greater density than 1 home per 5 acres of the permitted density or the permitted density determined by a yield plan for a conventional subdivision. Now, we have small areas where we don't have the 5-acre requirement, but they are few and far between. And I just learned from the mayor before this started that we probably have 20 properties that could meet the 25 acres or more at this point in time. A few years ago, I think it was 25.
Hey, Todd, if I can add one thing, this is Chris.
Please do that. If you want to
yeah.
talk about the yield plan too, that would be great.
Sure. So when there was discussion of attached units, there was kind of 2 developments that were thought of that if a development were to mimic them in their look and feel under a new development, they would likely fit within what is typically considered to be the Gates Mills look. One would be if a development were to have attached units that were to look like the older homes that are along Old Mill by the Hunt Club. The other one that was looked at in an adjacent community was Hunting Hill Farms on Spring River Road in Hunting Valley, where there's kind of a large manor house, and then there's some other buildings that look almost like accessory structures, but they're actually multiple unit condo buildings. So it would, again, emphasizing that creative sort of Gates Mills look and trying to accomplish that in a number of different ways. Those were the 2 developments that were kind of looked at for attaching units. With respect to the yield plan, the way we envisioned the conservation development ordinance working is the developer would really have to prepare 2 plans kind of in parallel with each other. One would be for a traditional subdivision using 5-acre lots, and the other one could be for this conservation development plan that would, again, allow for concentration of units towards the center of the property, 50% permanent conservation, more of the empty nester type development look. But a yield plan is where under any conservation development layout, the first effort that the developer would have to make would be to fully develop a layout plan that would be based on the traditional 5-acre zoning, including, not just doing a mathematical calculation of, say, 30 acres divided by 5 acres a lot is going to give me 6 lots. That's not the way this works. The way this works is they would have to show all the topography any streams, wetlands, substantial forested area, riparian setbacks, wetland areas, steep slopes and irregular topography that are protected by our code. They would have to show all those things in a very comprehensive existing conditions plan. And then in consideration of those things, develop a 5-acre layout plan that would work with the existing conditions. So they may, in fact, by the time they put a road in, they take these other things into consideration, they may only get 4 lots. And that then becomes the basis for how many lots they could arrange in their conservation development plan. So it's not just a mathematical calculation. And then all the while this plan is being developed, this yield plan of traditional 5-acre lots and the conservation development plan, Planning Commission would always reserve the right to go with either or. So they're maintaining the opportunity to have kind of a what you see is what you get development with any sort of a conservation development plan. That until it's approved by the Planning Commission, it's not anticipated that it's just the developer being able to come in and do whatever they want. They would have to get approval of a specific plan that has been compared to a traditional 5-acre development, and the Planning Commission would have to determine that that conservation development plan, for whatever reasons may be pertinent to that particular plan, has benefits over the traditional 5-acre layout.
Thank you.
That's it.
Todd, may I ask a question?
Sure.
I've heard that when the 5-acre minimum was instituted, that people with acreage, that they could choose to keep it at 2.5 acres if they so chose.
Correct.
It was an option they had. And I was wondering if any of the 25-acre lots that you've referred to, the 20 or so, I wonder if any of them elected to have 2.5-acre spacing, in which case the yield plan would be based on 2.5-acre spacing.
Mhm.
Do we know if that's the case?
You're testing my memory, but I do seem to recall we had a situation a few years back. But I believe it was in one of the smaller districts where I think 4 houses were put in.
Yeah, wouldn't they have had to subdivide the property at that
Yeah,
point
they
in
would have
time to
had to
create the
subdivide
smaller
it.
lots when that was done?
At the time, yes.
Yeah, so
I
perfect,
think some.
perfect example would be Sherman Road. So that 33 acres there was already subdivided at 2.5-acre lot sizes. So any of the larger lots now that were not subdivided prior to 1998, that option expired.
Yeah, okay, but it was a choice
So
they
it
had.
would have had to
They
have
had
been
choice at the
subdivided at
time.
that point in time.
So my question
Right,
really
and-
is, of the 20 properties we've just described as being eligible for the Conservation Development District, how many of them have 2.5-acre rights?
None of them.
Yeah,
None
I
of-
don't think any of
Okay.
them, because that's all 25-acre lots and larger, or other large lots that may be in common ownership
Okay.
that are next to each other that could be consolidated into one larger
Okay.
parcel.
Thank you.
I think the only one that qualified, David, was Sherman Road, the Newell property, but the Land Conservancy acquired that properties.
Yeah,
They
okay,
definitely
okay.
added to.
So we're talking entirely about 5 acres in this conversation. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And number 7, this is very important. There's to be restricted open space, and it has to be subject to a conservation easement. And the village is a beneficiary of those conservation easements. And open space on the development plan, all of it has to be contiguous. And you don't count area where there's either wastewater or stormwater facilities. Now, developers constantly want to include stormwater facilities by saying, oh, it's a pond. But our ordinance does, and an amenity to the development other than a functional amenity. So it's not counted.
Right, we want it to
Private-
be undisturbed areas. They're not gonna be cleared, not gonna be graded. We want areas that are gonna be set aside at the beginning of the development and left untouched.
And private streets are required unless the planning commission and council decide that there could be a public street. Mostly to get access into, but not access through the development. And the
All right.
setbacks are important here because it's a minimum setback of 50 feet from any private street for any building. Any building has to be a minimum of 100 feet from the boundary of the entire development, and a minimum of 200 feet setback of buildings and parking areas are included in that from any public streets that are not within the development. So it's attempting to cluster these homes, and again, I use cluster, and I don't think it's a negative word to use for this. We didn't use it because a lot of people think cluster has a negative connotation to it, and I don't believe it does. But it is to cluster those homes in the middle of the development, surrounded by open space, undisturbed open space, and not necessarily visible from public streets. You okay?
So Todd, with number 7 there,
Yeah,
the way that reads, the village would hold the conservation easement?
it's one of the beneficiaries, yes.
What do you mean, one of them?
Obviously, people who buy properties there would also be able to enforce it.
Yeah.
Or the homeowners association.
Right, and we discussed also from a stewardship standpoint, it may be prudent to involve either the Western Reserve Land Conservancy or the Gates Mills Land Conservancy in those protected areas, because they may have better stewardship protocols in place for
Mhm.
those areas as opposed to the village.
Right. Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
So,
And-
Todd, one other constraint.
Sure.
I recall people saying that the conservation easement area needs to be 50% of the total area, at least 50%.
I've got to look at that, but as you can see, down in number 12, the maximum impervious surface is only 10%.
Yeah, and it is a 50% permanent conservation area requirement.
So that's one of the specifications for qualification.
Yes.
Thank you.
And there's a 50-foot separation between buildings, but if you
Yeah.
have attached units,
Right.
there's a greater separation between buildings that house two homes, or 3 homes and 3 homes. So I think it goes from 50 to 75 to 100. And I have to note, as Chris mentioned, we have to look at the protected hillside zones ordinance and the riparian setbacks.
Mhm.
Trying to remember how long ago it was we put into place riparian setbacks, maybe 4 years ago. Ann Whitney, when she was on council, led the charge on that one. And we worked very closely with the Chagrin River Watershed Partners in developing that setback ordinance. I don't know, since it's been in, Craig, do you remember how many variances we've had for that? Maybe 2
I think
at
2 or
most.
3 that I can
Really some
recall.
minor things also. And then, with any variance, the Board of Zoning Appeals can put conditions on that are relevant and related to the request. So we've done a lot of landscaping and taking out of invasive species and requiring native plants in riparian areas if you're going to encroach a little bit into that area. And the procedures, a preliminary plan is required, which goes through the Planning and Zoning Commission. Extensive submission requirements. I still remember Scott 2 months ago reading through every one of those. And if you look at 1160.16, there is a lot of things to be submitted. And then the commission has the authority, if it wishes to refer the plan to the Architectural Board of Review and for Historic Review Board. And then a recommendation is given to council. So the village council must approve the preliminary plan before it can go forward. And then the submission of a final development plan, which is really detailed engineering and design and detailed engineering of improvements that go into the development, And that only goes to council. It doesn't go back to planning and zoning commission. And just thinking about this today, I thought, you know, this is framed at the beginning as a zoning district. And so I think that it would be wise to comply with state law probably at the preliminary plan stage to have a public hearing on these and giving 30 days notice of that public hearing before any approval. That's all I have. And any questions you might have? Go from there.
Maybe a couple questions.
Sure.
So Gates Mills implemented this in 2007, Moreland Hills 2012, 2013, Wade Hill, similar timeframe, Hunting Valley last fall. And so do we
Yeah, as a
know of?
result of a lawsuit.
Yeah, so if I'm a landowner, I've got 25 acres. I can put a street in with a cul-de-sac, put 5 homes in there, not have to go through any of these things. And we've got a new street in the village. Or the alternative is to go through this process where perhaps none of the homes are even visible from the road and there's a private drive that gets put in. So I guess, are we aware of any of these conservation development districts that have been done in any of these areas or elsewhere in the state?
City of Hudson, we had a provision for that.
And so a developer actually went through the process and put something in.
Yeah, this is a
Okay.
very stringent process.
Oh, yeah.
I think it needs to be. You know, the advantage to the developer is there's less streets and less utilities need to go in when you're clustering houses rather than doing a traditional subdivision. So that's the advantage for the developer to save some money. And depending on the community where perhaps empty nester housing and 55 and over housing, so restricted housing may be very popular and very lucrative for a developer to do that.
Yeah, if we want some real world examples, Scrivener River Watershed Partners was a proponent of this as well. And they helped provide some of the materials that were presented. They may have some real world examples that are drivable in the east side of Cleveland area. Also, as a part of the our exercise and going through and putting together the ordinance, I looked at 2 or 3 different large parcels in Gates Mills and laid out a development and what it would look like under the provisions of this ordinance. I can send that material out as well if anybody wants to see it.
We have 4 of these in Richmond Heights. We probably, what was it, Chris, 12, 14 years ago, where we put it in place. And 2 of them turned out really well. A couple of them haven't turned out real well. They had various phases to them and the developer went belly up and couldn't complete all the phases. So, yeah.
Can we get a question?
Yes, I did. My reading of 1160, over the season, a couple of versions. But my reading of 1160 implies that if the underlying zoning is less than 5 acres, if the other parameters are adjusted accordingly, is poorly worded in my opinion, and maybe I'm not reading it well. But the issue really is it 25 acres no matter what, or is it 25 acres but smaller if the underlying zoning?
It's 25 acres.
So I believe
It's 25 acres.
my recommendation is we add some clarifying language to that issue, so there's no interpretation other than 25 acres.
I think we can clear up the density provision there to make it a little more clear with respect to that yield rate. But it is 25 acres. I think I can easily defend that if it was ever challenged. Of course, someone could come in and ask for a area variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. I don't think this Board of Zoning Appeals would grant something that's less than 25 acres, but certainly a property owner would have that right to come in. And I think it could be turned down because you can always develop it otherwise. In a traditional subdivision or 1 home on 25 acres or 2 or 3 homes.
It was very
I mean,
good
if-
overview incidentally.
Yeah, if you think about the numbers that are stated in the ordinance regarding the amount of permanent conservation that's required, if you get under 20 acres or, under 15 acres, it makes sense to develop property with one house on it, because by the time you take, I say, a 20-acre lot and preserve, under this ordinance, 50% of it, which would be 10 acres, and then start looking at the other things that may complicate the development of the property, such as wetlands and streams and steep slopes and all the things that we have to deal with day in and day out in Gates Mills, you're really only talking about one or two houses. And at that point in time, if you've got a lot like that, you'd probably be better off just splitting it in two and having two houses.
And the other problem, and I'll bring it up, is that if these larger lots don't have access to sanitary sewer or water, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do this. EPA is not approving package plants much anymore at all. And there may be places where, well, there's 25 acres in Gates Mills that would have access or could be brought to the property fairly easily, maybe. So that's another impediment, I think, to development of some of these properties.
While we're on the topic of 1160, do any other council members have questions about that or comments about references in the comprehensive plan to maybe we should look at 1160 and freshen it up?
Well, in the comprehensive plan, there are at least two that I can remember suggestions made. One was that we consider lowering the 25 acres to a lower amount. And the other one was that we remove the first step of the two-step process. You don't have to do the yield plan. I don't happen to agree with either one of those modifications, but they were discussed, and in fact, they made it into the final document. So it seems to me we ought to have some discussion and dispose of it one way or the other.
My opinion is that to reduce the acreage, you get into a mathematical problem, as I just stated. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to reduce that, because I think you just end up creating something that can't be built realistically. And then regarding not requiring the yield plan, I would not recommend that, because I think the village should always reserve the right to require a developer to put in what is permitted under the standard zoning code. And only if it benefits the village and the planning commission council agree with that, would a conservation development be permitted. I think having those two plans run parallel is not that much more work for a developer. And it makes sure that you're going to get a development that, when compared to a standard 5-acre development, is going to be better. And that yield plan process ensures that.
I agree with Mr. Courtney on both counts.
I agree with Mr. Price on this. I mean, I think the statute's pretty good how it is. And quite frankly, just in seeing some of these come through planning and zoning, and I think the one you were referring to, Todd, was the Malacca property, which it's just a single family residence. Now someone bought it and they're using it as a house.
That's on River Road, right?
There are
It's
two
not-
houses, there.
A Malacca?
Yeah.
Yeah, they had
Right.
wastewater issues and
They had lots of issues.
they had an easement that they had, or a conservation easement that they had provided to the Western Reserve Land Conservancy, I believe, or Gates Mills Land Conservancy, which limited the number of houses on the lot, which I think is a hurdle I never got over.
Yeah, I think they were trying to get around the conservation easement. It never got to a formal application,
Okay.
as well as the Glennis property down on north of Som Center, Mayfield Road.
North of Mayfield, right? Yeah,
North of
Glennis property
Mayfield.
they were seeking a variance.
Yeah, because I think
never-
they had
they never
17 or
formally
18.
saw it.
I think they had 17 or 18 acres,
Right.
although they never applied either. They
No.
just did
Yeah,
a
they never really got to
presentation.
work, they never got
Didn't
to
get
a
very
workable
far.
plan.
Well, they looked at other properties as well. They may not have got to a formal application, They certainly looked at the Gorman property at one point. They looked at the Ross Lowenstein property that's next to mine. And I suppose you could say that 1160 Chagrin River Road, is that the name? Or 780?
780.
780 Chagrin River Road was a sort of an effort to use, although they didn't have the 25 acres.
They did not.
So there have been
Mm-hmm.
efforts to do it.
Yeah, so the 780, I think it's Glino's property, they came to the planning and zoning and they were trying to feel out whether they could get a variance, but they were asking for an advisory opinion, and planning and zoning doesn't give advisory opinions, and so we could just sit there and say,
Yeah, we gave them 1160 and said, these are all things you gotta do.
right.
One of the things was a package plan. I think that was a stumbling block to some extent. Chris had more detail on it, I think, but.
If I may, one funny comment I heard in an advisory committee meeting during the comprehensive plan, somebody said, well, 1160 obviously isn't working. And somebody else said, well, maybe it is.
Right.
It's two sides of a coin.
Yeah,
Did
exactly.
Perino look at one up there where he built,
He did not.
he didn't even consider it?
He didn't need any variances. There was 44 acres. They were able to do eight houses.
Plenty of land.
Isn't that the one I'm thinking about that almost went through the whole process?
No.
They never.
No,
came.
they were always a standard development there along Wilson or Brigham and County Line.
I have to go back through my files, but there was one that partway through and.
So the Gorman property, the Gorman/Jones property, they came with a plan, but that
Didn't-
didn't happen. It
No.
was-
Now, I guess the residents who filled out our survey, they could say they don't like the adjacent provision, that you can have adjacent houses. Because the only place in the code that we have that allows adjacent. But it's kind of a moot point since there hasn't been one. And anyone would have to go
He
to
means the back,
council
Joe.
twice, right? The preliminary and the final.
And would we be, if this didn't exist, would we be happy?
Yeah, I mean,
I think so too. And I think the villagers would be very happy.
I will say, and I want to be very careful about it. I mean, the development up on the Loop property, I mean, that could have been a really good use of this. If you were gonna do this somewhere, that might have been
Yeah.
it might have been a good place to do it.
Yeah.
It would have, the Loop house was pretty hidden back there. You didn't know it was there when you drove by, and you might have been able to pull this off, keeping it almost exactly that way. And so, while the person said it's not working, right? Someone said, well, this isn't working, so we need to change it to make it work. You have to remember that there could be a variance that if there were the right opportunity in a right way, in a different place, I mean, it is within the power of the village to grant a variance that would allow that to happen. But it would take all the steps that Todd just went through
Sure.
here. They would all those same steps would still be there.
Yep.
There just also have to be a variance.
Yep.
So the person that said it's not working, I mean, I suppose it could work. But no one's come up with anything that's worth working.
Yeah, I mean, my view of it is that that section of the code isn't necessarily meant to encourage development. But given the fact that the easily developed portions of the village have already been developed, it's there to provide an option for large parcels if somebody wants to try to build a development the right way and it works for both the developer and the village, but not necessarily to, spur on development and encourage somebody to come in and start gobbling up large parcels. As Todd mentioned, there's other issues as it relates to sanitary sewers and utility service that create a major problem. We looked at the same time at doing what would be considered maybe a traditional cluster development with multiple attached units in an even larger conservation requirements and, and we had a developer that worked with us that we brought in to look at the economic feasibility of doing a development like that. And because of the remote nature of a lot of these parcels, the difficulty in servicing them with sanitary sewers, his conclusion was that the developer would need to get the land for free because it would be so expensive to service everything with the necessary sanitary facilities in order to support a concentrated development. So really, if there's anything that is hindering the utilization of this section of the code, it is going to some sort of non-standard individual going away from some individual lot septic system and to some sort of consolidated facility or smaller lots that would require a package plant and problems with sanitary sewers. It really is the biggest hindrance.
Todd, so question. So hypothetically, if homeowner came to planning and zoning and was asking for a variance to put in a street to put a subdivision in their property, as a basis for denying that potential variance, could planning and zoning cite 1160 as there are other ways for you to develop your property that don't require a variance that may or may not be substantial that the commission may or may not grant?
Correct.
Versus if this was not in the code, there's no other option for a developer to use.
That's exactly
potentially.
right. The reason we put it in there was to have something to point to say, okay, here's something you can do. And we're not taking your property or not letting you develop your property. And there's a lot of challenged properties out there with steep hillsides, repairing corridors, all of that, that sometimes, you don't have a big footprint to be able to put homes in.
Yeah, not every piece of property is developable the way that a developer would like to develop it. One
Like
of
to
the
do it
things
as
that,
a traditional way.
yeah, one of the things that they have to identify on their yield plan is remote land. So if you've got a big flat area that is at the back of a piece of property that's separated from the front by a huge ravine, that back flat land area may not be developable because it is not feasible to be able to get to it from the front of the parcel, which is where access would have to be. So that is, that's a part of the exercise of the yield plan, is identifying those remote lands as well.
Ed or Sandra or Lori, any comments you care to add on section 1160 or questions?
No, I'm fine. Good presentation and discussion.
Yeah, ditto, thank you.
Okay, so can I suggest that the sense of council was that they've considered the comprehensive plan suggestions of the less than 25 acres and adjustments to the yield plan, and decided that the current provisions and language remain appropriate and adjustments aren't necessary, or some similar language.
Yes.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah, me too. So would I.
Okay, Todd, how do we document that for
In
the
minutes.
record, in the minutes?
And truthfully, I will look at those provisions to see if we need to really clarify them. I think the yield plan is confusing, so that in itself, that language probably ought to be clear.
So David, Michael, Scott, and Craig all say yeses.
Yes.
I didn't ask for a vote. Ed, are you comfortable with what I summarized? That council has looked at the suggestions of changing the 25 acres and the yield plan, believes the current language and provisions are appropriate?
I'm having trouble hearing it.
Okay, I'm sorry, I should have been here closer. So we're trying to get a sense on some of these items that are open from the comprehensive plan and see whether we can have conversation and close them so that they're not remaining open. And someone has come back in 5 or 10 years and say, geez, you never really wrestled with that issue. So we just wrestled with the 1160 issue. And from the sense of what the conversation was, my conclusion was that council has considered the comprehensive plan suggestions to reduce the 25 acres and to adjust the yield plan, and has decided, council has decided that the current provisions and language remain appropriate and that adjustments to the language are not needed. Lori? Sandra?
Sandra, your mic's off,
Still muted.
still off.
Sandra, you okay with 1160 as it's written? Thumbs up?
Gonna give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, Sandra?
Yes.
That's okay, but. Yeah.
Thumbs up.
Okay.
There we go.
And Ed, how about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
I'm along with not modifying it. yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank
I
you.
just got these new ones and they're acting up.
Okay, so thank you for that conversation. Well, we have Todd on the phone, I'm sorry, Todd here and Chris on the phone. There were references in the comprehensive plan to adjusting or considering adjustments to the required frontage, side lot and setback requirements in the downtown commercial district.
Yeah, to reducing those requirements. I'm not familiar with the genesis of that. I'm not sure where it came from, but obviously it would allow for higher density housing than is there presently. And I did sit down with Chip and we worked out that you could have 30 houses on Glenbrook and 10 on Colvin if the existing houses weren't there and you got rid of the requirements for frontage, side lot and setback.
Well, it does say commercial district, and that's tiny. You can't even see it hardly. It's orange on the map. Across the street down at the Old Livery Tavern. So I didn't know what the issue was there.
Yeah,
The front, in old downtown areas, it's always a front setback issue, and our code currently says, as I recall, it's a 50-foot setback from the center line of the public street. So that gets you, your building pretty close to the street, which is a good thing. So I don't know.
Yeah, I guess my reading of that was more around, I'm looking here on page 50, consider reducing the front and side yard requirements to retain the existing characteristic of houses close to the street and to each other. And it basically goes on to say the zoning code requires houses to be set back at least 50 feet from the right of way. And effectively, you can only have a house 20 feet wide under the current regulations. So we're talking about shrinking that so that if someone were to come in here and try to maybe build a house that's bigger than 20 feet wide because of the setbacks, that it might allow for an addition on a home or something to be done. That was my reading of this, not that it would allow more. And again, I'm just reading here, that means after accounting for a 30-foot side yard on a 50-foot wide lot, the house can only be 20 feet wide and the houses next to each other must be separated by at least 30 feet. Yet many homes in the U1 A4 district are much closer together, some as close as 7 or 8 feet.
That sounds like something that for P and Z more than an alteration of the zoning code to me.
We don't have a lot of variance requests. We just had an addition, Scott and Craig, right?
Well, right, that's where the old cottages that are adjacent to where the Hunt Club is, those 3 properties there. One of those homes has already been redeveloped, bad word, not redeveloped, rehabilitated and brought up to 21st century standards. And now the new homeowners that moved into one of the other ones are doing the same. And so where the garage is, I mean, I think it's a 5-foot setback because it's really in a commercial district, but there are 3 residential homes that are there.
Yeah, it's in the purple.
It's U3. It's in the U3 area.
Mhm.
Right.
So Craig, could you just summarize why you think that recommendation, what it was meant potentially to allow for, what situation?
Again,
aware
I'm
of
just
that.
reading the strategy C2, U1A4 zoning district minimum lot size requirements in the village center, that talks about what's there now. Almost, I think anything that you would do there would need a variance.
So, Lori, I think
Mhm.
if I could summarize all this, Michael, so Michael's talking really, he's focused on Glenwood Road here. And if all those houses came down, the
Mhm.
current
If a
zoning
developer came in and bought a bunch up,
bottom
they're
up,
like 3 or 4 acres now, the ones
right,
that are.
some of them are on larger lots, but the zoning would allow 7,500 square foot lots in whatever particular configuration. And so, I'll take the count. I've never counted it, but was it 34?
Uh,
33?
Chip worked out 30 on the west side, on the Glenwood side, and 10 on the Colvin side.
So,
We're theoretically possible if a developer got a hold of the property that's there.
so that you could build on 7,500 square foot lots, you could put in a large number, 40 houses or something there.
Which didn't seem like a desirable outcome to me.
And the thing is though, the provisions that Craig's talking about in there, because I can see now that using the zoning, and I'm not doing an exact calculation, but the house would have to be about 12 feet wide or 15 feet wide and really deep in order to fit on the lot and comply with the side setback. The front setback, I think that says from the right of way, but I think.
Middle.
But the rules from the middle of the road, so it's actually a little closer. So for example, if you were gonna try to recreate Jamie Carrechter's house and the house next to it on Colvin, you would not be able to do that without a variance under the current regulations. And that's what that suggestion, I think, is trying to say that the zoning ought to be changed to allow people to, I don't know, go 10 feet or something away, or so the houses would be closer, so the house would be wider, it would be.
And what I'm saying is that doesn't sound to me like we need to change the zoning in general.
No.
Right.
It sounds to me like if there's a specific instance, let you and Craig and P and Z work it out.
Right, right. And I would tend to agree with that, right.
Because it probably would be one-off unless you had the developer situation, right? Something happened to the house, tree fell on it.
That's it.
And you needed to rebuild, so you'd come for a variance. But it was already there, so you'd have a good chance.
You have a good chance of getting it.
Very good
of course.
Right.
So could the code be modified there? So effectively you could not split any of those lots. So elsewhere in the village, if you were to subdivide, for example, a 10-acre parcel, you could put that into 2 parcels. Could there be something specific to that district that would effectively say, this is the smallest lot size that is going to be permitted
I like that.
in the village now, which is, and again, I kind of question why that little arm of why Glenwood is even considered part of the downtown area. I wouldn't consider that to have any of the historic value that the downtown area has. And so maybe that section gets rezoned. I'm just, what would prevent someone from going in there and saying, yes, I'm going to go in here and put in 8 7,500 square foot lots, and you're going to have
Zoning district are we talking about?
We're talking about, so
The
Glenn.
green area?
where Glenwood is, right? So I was thinking during all this that this is the downtown area, and Michael's specifically referring to like Glenwood, which is the A4, U1A4, which is on the north side of the river.
It's the first street you come to when you drive north on Mayfield. That's on the west side of the street. There's Colvin on the right
Mhm.
and Glenwood on the left.
So could somebody today come in here and say, hey, I bought this house, I want to put 5 lots in here, 7,500 each, I'm gonna tear the house down and put, again, I mean, maybe somebody would want a house that's only 20 feet wide and they'd have to ask for variances. But I kind of look at that and say, should that section there even really be part of the, downtown area? Maybe this is, hey, let's look at zoning.
Well, I mean, should we change that to the, 'cause right now it's U1 H1A4.
Yep.
We change it to U1 H1A3, which is 0.34. I mean,
That would solve. the
Or even to
But I
A2.
don't know that you
like
could
what-
do
what
that
all up and
with an
down
existing
Gates.
owner, change their zoning without their consent. And why would they give that consent?
They could do it. Well, we could do it without their
It's in
consent.
those
Yeah.
districts, right?
It is in the historic district,
Mhm.
yes.
So you're gonna have restrictions. Yeah.
I-
Rebuilding.
I mean, the general character is houses a little closer together than the traditional 5 acres, but 7,500 lot square, they're pretty small.
Yes, it is.
And maybe, I mean, how do they even get a septic on there? Chris, how do they even get a septic on a 7,500 square foot lot? You don't want to know.
How big? 7,500 square feet?
Right.
No way.
Yeah, it would be very difficult to do that with current standards that are in place for non-discharging systems. It would have to be probably some sort of, it'd have to be a knockdown of an existing house and reuse of some portion of the existing system. But on a new 7,500 square foot lot, it'd be really tough.
Are there homes, existing homes on 7,500 square foot?
Oh, no, there, I don't know. I
There
haven't.
might be an example or two. The same question is, how do they get a septic in there?
Right.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe
I'm fine.
it isn't, maybe it isn't there anymore.
As long as they maintain it.
Yeah.
When were the historic districts established? Have they been
I
expanded?
would say the more important question is how.
They have not been, this has traditionally always been the historic districts of Gates Mills?
That's
That's my understanding too, and
We need Sarah here for that.
that's a good lead into the next thing that came out
Yeah.
of the comprehensive plan, because there was quite a good deal of discussion about, there were people that weren't in the historic district that thought they ought to be because of the nature of their building. And there were other people who were in it who didn't want to be in it, subject to all the restrictions. And we learned that for whatever reason, they wanted, at the time the application was made, they wanted it to be contiguous. And it was the trying to be contiguous which caused there to be some houses on the outside wanting to be inside and other houses on the inside wishing they were outside. So there was a suggestion, maybe we should reconsider the historic district and what's in and what's out. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just saying it's something that came, we should talk about it because it was something that got a lot of discussion.
Yeah, it's been suggested that it should at some point be relooked at.
I would be in favor of that. I mean, this looks like a good case of gerrymandering if I ever saw one in terms of the,
From 20,000 feet, is it appropriate? Does it include the right building?
well, and that, what does historic mean?
Yeah. Well,
So-
actually, it's defined in the federal law around historic district, the federal statute, right, around historic district.
Oh, it is.
So
but
there is a definition.
There are restrictions for people who own property in the historic district.
Correct.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's
exactly-
why some people that are in want out. They don't want to be subject to the restrictions they don't think should apply to their building.
Right.
Right, so and there's also been discussion that we should have disclosures, like real estate disclosures, which is a little controversial, right?
Mike.
Oh, real estate disclosures around the historic district.
So the
Just-
guy knows before he buys.
Yeah, I
Some
was gonna
people-
say,
He's
I
gonna
don't
be subject-
remember, now, of course, we bought our house 34 years ago, but I don't remember any discussion about, and Mr. Morgan, you are in the historic district.
And so you
Yeah.
have to, right, yeah.
Obligations, yeah.
It's something that we've talked about. Again, it's there's some folks who would say, that would maybe hinder sales, but on the other hand, I would be in favor of it personally because I feel like people should know, go into it eyes wide open when they buy that home.
Mhm.
Um,
I don't have a history as to how this was established. And, it would be probably appropriate for P and Z to pick this up and look at it.
Well, yeah, and my guess is that over time, as someone saw a house that said, oh, that's a historic house that should be in the district and let's expand it this way. And someone else saw and said, well, it needs to go this way. And to me, maybe this is very naive, but if it's not in the downtown center of the village, and I've said this before, just because something is old does not make it historic.
I think part of it too was tying in the Wilson Mills historic area. And so that.
And that was
I think
the other
that's
end of
how
the village, correct, yeah.
contiguous-
Wilson, the corner of Wilson Mills and Mayfield
Right.
and here.
Right.
So yes.
We could, there's no rush to do this one, considering everything else that we've got going on, but this would be a good project, to look into as long as council doesn't want to do it immediately. Like if this is a look at this in 2025, I'm happy to put it on the list and
I don't
go
think
through the
there's a
files.
hurry.
No, but I think there
But,
should be,
You gotta assign it to the historic committee,
there should be a
Okay.
rationale for,
come back with some recommendations.
Because I'm sure there's lots of files somewhere and opinions and applications and so on to get on the National Register of Historic Places, which is where it ended up.
The good news is, Craig, there are standards and definitions that are established.
but I think even just for someone that moves into the village, that there would be a rationale for why am I in the historic district or why am I not? And hey, my house was built in
Flyer that
1982, why is it historic? Well, because the house next door is. Well, so I think that would be helpful for residents.
I think so too, just in general communication and then whether, how you would, in a sale situation, require those disclosures. I think we'd need council's advice.
I think that we could require that.
Can we legislate it?
I think so.
Mhm.
So Todd,
I haven't done a residential disclosure form in a long time, but you would think someone would put that on there.
Mr. Spear.
Material that was submitted for the approval, and that package includes letters from probably each of the owners of the 13 houses there, commenting on their approval of the process. So other than that, it's very murky as to how this became the historic district and whether anyone who acquires knows they're in the historic district. A car came in with a builder's sign on it looking at 640 a couple of weeks ago. He said, maybe I'll buy that. And I said, make sure you go talk to Dave Bigger because there are some standards here as to how that building is going to be built. But I think it's very interesting that realtors sell houses in our historic district without ever mentioning to anyone, don't dream a dream about what you're going to do with this house without checking. So I think the suggestion that we do a good look at how you got in the historic district and whether you should be in there is very appropriate.
So Todd, in looking at this map, the only thing that I can figure, and this is gonna sound pretty simple, but it's a historic district, singular. I don't know, maybe there was some requirement that it had to be one district, that we were forming a district, like a sewer district, that's got to be contiguous. And that's why they included all this property, but for the life of me, I can't figure why the stuff that's west of north of Mayfield, west of River Road, that's Metro Parks property. I can't figure why there's,
That's a
nothing
good
on it.
question.
That was,
So maybe it was drawn because it had to be a contiguous district. I don't know the law in that area, but that's.
I don't think so.
Because it's got part of lots on it. I mean, John Spurk's property, only part of it's in it, Right.
We had 2 or 3 historic districts in Hudson. They were not contiguous.
So Sarah wrote me back. She thinks it was roughly 30 years ago, but those are all really good questions that we probably need to research, and Chuck's on the committee with me as well. So I think I'll mention to Sarah that we take that up.
Okay, so with those two items, what can can I suggest this, that on the, one we just covered a few minutes ago, the front, side and setback requirements in the downtown district, that council has considered the comprehensive language to look at potential changes to the front, side and setback requirements, and believes that no changes are required, and items of this nature can best be handled by P and Z.
Yes.
Correct.
Yep.
Everyone
Yep.
okay with that?
Uh-huh.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, this is, all right, this is that one was 1160. This one is A. 3A. No, we'll get it. And with regard to 3C, can I suggest that the language is that council considered comments on the historic district and believes it's best to be further informed by referring this to the historic subcommittee for future review and presentation, something along those lines.
Agreed.
I would agree.
Okay. That then leaves us with one item on this list, although again, this was just a sample of the list. You all may have other things that you want to cover. But the last item was potential walking paths, bridle trails, and bike paths.
Before we do that, can I just ask maybe one question? So I've been involved in planning and zoning last, I don't know, 8 or 9 years. And so, I tend to pay attention to things that maybe I shouldn't be, but and Todd brought this up a little bit earlier about the state preempting local rule and local law. And so Oregon, the state of Oregon in 2019, passed and signed HB 2001, which restored the opportunity, among other things, to build duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters on lands currently zoned exclusively for single-family homes. Minnesota, Minneapolis, the same thing. New York is working on the same thing, California. So effectively taking away the village's right to say, no, this is zoned single-family only. We're not going to let you do that anymore. The state of Ohio comes down and says, you have to allow triplexes, you have to allow duplexes or anything else on this.
Yeah.
Oh, and the 5-acre zoning is, pick whatever your favorite comment is of the day, but you're only, it's racist, it's too exclusive, or you're trying to keep people out of the village. You can't do that. It's got to be lower. And so those are some of the concerns I have with some of the larger properties that we can sit around here and talk about this, and that's fine, but all of a sudden the state of Ohio comes down and says, guess what? You can't have single family housing anymore.
Yeah, Craig's absolutely right.
and what-
I'm a property owner in California. And in California, what they did is they gave everybody the right to build an alternate dwelling unit. And they defined what the requirements were, but they basically overruled all the local authorities and said, anybody in California can build an alternate development unit on their property if they want to, regardless of what your local community has to say about
Yeah.
it.
So my question to
As long
Todd
as it meets
is,
the requirements.
so outside of, let's take, so my parcel of land, it could be subdivided into, hey, if we went to a 1 acre minimum, it's something different. If we were to go to residents and say, you're going to deed your property over to the Gates Mills Land Conservancy for 20 seconds, they're going to put an easement on there that on your parcel, only one single family home can be built, and it gets deeded right back to you. So whatever the state decides to do, or the legislature that says, guess what? You can't change your single family zoning. Well, it doesn't really matter because we've gone through and spent 5 years, 3 years, whatever the number is, effectively deed restricting properties as an option that only a single family home can be built.
Yes.
Right.
we did that.
What was that?
Covenant that ran with the land.
sure.
You can get property owners to agree to that.
But
posted on that?
I have never heard of that in Ohio or being proposed in Ohio.
And I wouldn't think so
Doesn't
either,
matter,
but
you know, doesn't mean it won't happen.
Well, you know, the effect there has been to drive real estate prices up and make it harder for people to buy first houses because the developers know that the capitalized value of that property, if you're gonna put 2 units on it and rent it, it's worth even more. So if someone would have paid $1 million for it, now they're willing to pay $1.6 million. And the poor guy that's looking to buy a first house might be able to afford $1 million, can't afford $1.6 million.
Unless
So
you
they've
rent.
effectively caused the
Mhm.
inflation of the prices of the housing. Because now every single one of those, you can look at it and say, oh, I put 2 or 3 units on it, capitalize the cost. And I'm gonna rent it and I'll
Mhm.
make more money. So, but I think as long as this downstate portion of the state is in control of the capital, I don't
Yeah.
think we have to worry
Yeah.
about this.
Right.
But, you know,
but I just wanted to bring it up because it's a concern and I see it happening in states and I worry about, all of a sudden, are we 15 or 20 years down the road and those decisions are taken out of our hands? And could we have been doing something in the interim to inoculate ourselves from that? So.
So Todd, so to follow on with Craig's thing, if they were to do that, take away home rule, I mean, they couldn't change a deed restriction.
Oh.
They couldn't change a conservation easement that we have already, right?
Right.
I mean, because that has to run in perpetuity with the land.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as zoning, I mean, all of our zoning is vulnerable to being hijacked by state or
state.
federal government.
And it's to the advantage of the property owner, so what's the problem legally?
Right.
Well, doesn't it depend on how you look at it, though? Right?
I don't know.
I mean, it might not be to my advantage if I don't want my neighbor having a triplex that I'm looking at out my bedroom window.
Those are the most difficult cases, is neighbors trying to argue that you've taken my property by approving something next door.
Okay, so the last item on here was potential changes for walking paths, bridle trails, and bike paths. I don't know whether you want to tackle that one yet tonight. We're on a pretty good pace. Mike, if you want to start the
That was an
conversation.
interesting discussion. I mean, it was a bimodal distribution. There was a group that thought it was a good idea, and there was a group who thought it was a terrible idea. I would say by and large, the terrible idea group were the people who lived in places they thought people might want to use for bike paths or walking paths or bridle paths. Like people who live along River Road, for example, by Chagrin River, that kind of thing. But there were strong feelings on that and no consensus that I could detect or none.
Well, I think any change to that is unnecessary. I mean, most people, by virtue of the zoning that we have, they want to go for a nature walk, they have enough land of their own property to go for a nature walk. We have the North Chagrin Reservation is right there. South Chagrin Reservation is right down there. Chapin Woods is right off of Hobart. There's plenty of places if you want to go to Orchard Hills Park, Geauga Park District, the Rookery. There's a lot of places if you want to go walk.
Yeah, I'm kind of persuaded by Scott's argument there. The North Chagrin is literally the trailheads at part of Gates Mills right now.
Right. And for any residents that live up on the top of the valley, if they wanted to ride their bike, practically speaking, many of them will not ride their bike down. If the trail was in the valley, they would put their bike on their car and drive it down here. So they could drive a little further and go to the North Chagrin Reservation, South Chagrin Towpath Trail. I think it's unnecessary.
I agree.
I agree.
Do me.
What about bridle trails? I mention it just because it was so interesting to go back to, I think it was in the managed growth section that talked about the bucolic environment compatible with equine uses in the village. And I do know that there's fewer and fewer accessible bridle
There's
trails.
also fewer and fewer horses.
Yes.
these days.
That's
And, and a lot of the horses at the hunt club now are
They don't
hunters
do-
and jumpers.
They don't
that-
do
that-
bridle
that-
trails.
They do not do
Yeah.
bridle
Don't need
trails.
bridle trails.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's true. I just,
So I'm gonna say the same thing. So there are bridle trails at the North Shore Ground Reservation. They have a designated spot to park your trailers.
Well maintained, I might add.
Say again, sir?
They're well maintained
Yeah.
as well.
And I think there's some bridle trails by the polo field, the
There
Pine
are?
Hills
There
Polo
are.
Field, if I'm not mistaken.
there are-
And I think there are some there back behind the hunt club
Yeah, there are.
property.
Yeah.
And
but
so I think that expanding it more is kind of unnecessary. And we're gonna go tell the park, we're gonna cut.
On the bridle trail issue, nobody wanted to expand it. What people were talking about, if I got it right, was that there used to be trails that have now gone out of use.
Yeah.
And it was restoring and returning to the days of yesteryear. That was, which, you know, emotionally sounds very appealing, but raises issues. I mean, if you restore the bridle trail and somebody uses a dirt bike on it, is that gonna go down? Not too well.
not too.
No.
And there was no discussion of maintenance of these trails or liability exposure the village or the owners might have. So it wasn't a proper consideration of the matter.
Well, we used to ride in the street, so.
Yeah, that's true too.
They're a mystery for most of us who grew up in the village. The horses would come out of the barn. They'd go to Long Epping for a little bit and then they'd sneak into the woods somewhere and ride through these mysterious trails that who knew where they went, you know? You did, unless you had a horse, and unless you did that.
You didn't know. Yeah, it's true.
The same way as on the other four, that council has considered the suggestions and considers the potential use of bridle trails, walkways, and bike paths as unnecessary.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Sandra, thumbs up, maybe if you're still there. Okay, Ed, you good with that? Thank you. Are there any other items in your recollection of the comprehensive plan that are zoning or land related that we should tackle? If not today, for another meeting, because I think this will close out the open item that's been there for a number of months.
I think it's fair to say in the comprehensive plan discussions I heard most of them, is that there was no impetus for increasing the number of residences in the village or increasing the population of the village. A lot of discussion about upgrading this and that and substitution, but not addition. And certainly not at the expense of increased density. So I think the people in the village don't want to see any of this. So I don't think it's a question of facilitating development that we should be thinking about. It's doing what the people want, which is not to facilitate development. I don't think there's a feeling of adding anything, but improving what we already have.
Okay, thank you.
Sandra texted, she agrees.
Thank you.
Yeah, she wasn't able to get in.
You're gonna put Mike Fagg out of a job on the technology side. You know, if he's out on vacation, you become the Zoom queen. Any other comments from council? Well, I would thank you for attending and joining us in our workshop. And Todd, thank you for your preparation. And Chris, your preparation and participation on the phone. And with that, we need a
Happy
motion
to
to adjourn the meeting.
participate.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Scott. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you all.